I now look to Jeremy Bowen to close the case for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, sitting there for the last hour or so, I have heard a lot of wisdom coming from this side. Wisdom I don't necessarily agree with, but it's been a very interesting thing to hear. I've heard a little bit of cultural determinism about dress codes. I don't buy that when it comes to democracy, I'm afraid. Does the fact that in Jerusalem there are many ultra-Orthodox Jews who wear the clothes which originated in Poland and Lithuania in the 18th century, does that in any way affect Israel's status as a vibrant democracy? I don't think so. When I think of democracy in the Middle East, I think of the 11th of February, 2011. That was the day that President Mubarak stood down after weeks of demonstrations in Tahrir Square, and I was lucky enough to be there the whole time. And I was lucky enough to be there at that very moment when it was announced on the radio that he was going. And I'm telling you, the place erupted. It erupted because they thought a seismic change was happening in their region. And you know, it wasn't just the middle classes either. The people who'd been battling Mubarak's thugs in the previous weeks were not guys who'd been to graduate school in the US. They were people who were wiry and dressed in rags, many of whom I suspect couldn't read, but they could fight. And they were part of the reason, a big part of the reason why things changed there. And I think as well about the 12th of February, the following day, when people were asked to bring cleaning equipment down to Tahrir Square. And they brought buckets and mops and brooms. They even went round, there was a sort of shingle beach of rubble, which they chucked at the police over the previous 3 weeks or so. And in the midst of it as well, there were these very nice decorative cobblestones. And they went round even sifting through the rubble, picking up the cobblestones, finding the places they rooted them up from, and putting them back down in there. Now, this wasn't because they had some kind of OCD going on. It was because they thought, finally, it was their country again, that they possessed their country, that it was no longer going to be the playthings of the elites, that maybe they were going to have a say in it. In other words, that it was going to be a democracy. And as we've heard, there is only one kind of democracy. Western democracy, for all the reasons that Sir Malcolm has said, it has that name, but let's not get, he's made all those arguments very, very well. You know, I'm certainly not going to stand here and argue for the merits of the Chinese variant on democracy, the Russian variant on democracy, perhaps ultimately even the North Korean variant on democracy. The fact is, either it's an authoritarian system or it's a democratic system. There's not a great deal in between. Why has it failed thus far in so many countries? Not least in Egypt. And to stick with that example, I think in Egypt one of the problems was that there were two very organized groups in the country. One was the military, the other one was the Muslim Brotherhood. And those who wanted a more democratic system didn't get their act together. They weren't able to provide any kind of rivalry for those two very entrenched contrary groups. Now, why couldn't they? And this is, I think, the nub of the argument. It's because democracy to work in the Middle East, as it needs to work everywhere, it needs to have institutions that people can trust. It needs to have institutions that people can believe in. It needs a legal system that works. It needs a system as well that doesn't depend on corruption. It means as well that if you have a contract for a business, it can be honored, and if it's not honored, you can take someone to court. That's all part of democracy. Democracy is not just about the process of voting every couple of years. That kind of vibrant society, that kind of civil society, is something that sadly hasn't just not emerged in many Middle Eastern countries, it's been actively prevented from emerging. And that, I think, is a real problem. It doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that we should dismiss those countries, those peoples, as being unsuitable for democracy. It just means that there have been significant forces preventing them from seizing it. You know, I think it's no accident that President Sisi, former Field Marshal Sisi in Egypt, has, as part of his massive crackdown and crooked elections, that he has cracked down on NGOs, and particularly those dealing with things like human rights, because he does not want that kind of civil society to grow up, because then he'll have the military system will start having more of a rival. He is, of course, the West's great friend, and we're quite happy with everything that he's doing. Well, maybe we're not happy, but you know, it's good to have an address to talk to. It was far more difficult when it was confused. Let me get on to the Western role in democracy in the Middle East. Back in 2006, President Bush was very insistent that the Palestinians should have an election. The Israelis told him it was a bad idea. The Palestinian president told him it was a bad idea. Why? Because the fact is they thought Hamas might win. And Hamas, running under a different name, but Hamas won. Now, a few months after that, I was in the US State Department in Washington, D.C. And it's a fairly nondescript 1950s or 1960s building, but in the significant, powerful floors, they've got beautiful wood paneling. It's almost as wonderful as the Oxford Union. And a gentleman, a very senior diplomat, in one of those rooms, sat back in his chair. I was lucky enough to get an off-the-record with him, and he said, look, well, the first thing we're going to have to do is get rid of that election. You know, Hamas winning an election, forget it. We can't live with that. So we are going to do everything we can to make sure it's not going to function. And that pretty much was what happened. And they were good at that, and it worked. But, you know, that's the problem with democracy sometimes. It's something the West will have to get used to, is that sometimes it comes up with a result you don't like. So I think that it's important to do all those things, to build institutions, to enable people to function. This is not going to be a quick process. Let me go back even further in time. 1819, the Peterloo Massacre. Now, for those of you who've studied British history will know very well that in 1819 there was a massive demonstration in St. Peter's Fields in Manchester, 60,000, 70,000 people campaigning, demanding an extension of suffrage, an extension of the vote. What did the authorities do? They sent in the cavalry with drawn sabers, who ran into the crowd, wounding hundreds, and by some miracle, only, as far as I can see from looking at different sources, only killing about 15. But it's a remarkable footstep on our progress in this country towards democracy. And, you know, perhaps in the oak-panelled rooms of Westminster and of London, when all that happened, and the government did crack down on suffragists after that, they said, well, you know, these people, perhaps they're not suitable for democracy. Well, of course they were suitable for democracy. It just took a little bit longer to change the law, to extend the franchise, to build the civil society, to make the kind of fertile ground that's necessary for democracy to function. Sadly, at the moment, that doesn't exist in many Middle Eastern countries. I think that one day it will. I think it's possible. And I base that on over many years talking to an awful lot of people about their aspirations and their hopes, and seeing as well the activities of the corrupt and violent governments who very often they've tried to, when they can, try to overthrow. How do they achieve this? Well, they need our help, to start with. They need some freedom to build those institutions which will spawn democracy. And more than anything else, I think we need patience. There is a massive historical change going on in the region. It is not going to produce final results in this electoral cycle. It's not going to produce them maybe in this generation. But this process of change is continuing, and ladies and gentlemen, ultimately I think that it will result in democracy in the region. That's why I urge you to vote with our side. Thank you.